Imagine this. You're a mother, 95 years old, and your son has been locked in a Russian prison for years. You've written letters, begged officials, and done everything you can, but no one listens. Then one day, you find yourself face to face with the one person who might be able to help. Mr. Trump, I need you to promise me something, she says, her voice trembling. Bring my son home. What would you do if you were in his shoes? Most politicians would brush it off. But Donald Trump? He didn't hesitate. He looked her in the eyes and said, I promise you, I will bring him home. But promises are easy to make. Keeping them, that's where it gets tricky, especially when you're trying to convince a foreign government to release an American prisoner. The stakes were high, the pressure immense. Was he truly going to keep his word? And then, one day, the impossible happened. Marc Fogel, after years in a Russian prison, was suddenly freed. No one saw it coming. The promise had been kept. But how? What did it take to get him home? Before we begin, let us know where you are watching from. And if you believe in fighting for the helpless and showing kindness to humanity, be sure to like and subscribe for more. Let us begin.
In the fall of 2021, Marc Fogel, an American teacher in Russia, found himself in a nightmare no one ever expects, detained by Russian authorities on charges related to marijuana possession. What was meant for pain management turned into a nightmare as Russian authorities sentenced him to 14 years in a maximum security penal colony, an unusually harsh punishment for a crime that, in many other places, would have resulted in a fine or minor legal consequences. The arrest, which seemed to have little basis, quickly sparked outrage and concern across the globe, as Marc's supporters argued the charges were politically motivated. However, for Mary Fogel, Marc's 95-year-old mother, it was much more personal. Her son had been taken from her, and she wasn't sure if she'd ever see him again. When they took Marc, it felt like my world had fallen apart. He wasn't just my son, he was my best friend, Mary said, her voice filled with emotion as she spoke about the struggle that followed. Marc's arrest didn't just create a sense of despair, it highlighted the danger of being an American abroad during times of tension with countries like Russia. What made it even worse for Mary was the silence from many high-ranking officials. For months, her calls for help seemed to fall on deaf ears. I didn't know who to turn to, Mary said. I wrote letters, I made phone calls, but nothing seemed to work. And every day that passed, I feared the worst. But how do you get the attention of world leaders when so many other issues dominate the headlines? The media coverage of Marc's case was widespread, but as the months dragged on, it seemed like the situation was getting worse, not better. His family, his friends, and even his colleagues rallied together to call for his release, but the pressure from the Russian government remained strong. Mary, however, refused to give up. Even at 95 years old, she was determined to fight for her son. Little did she know that a chance encounter with a presidential candidate would change everything. During the 2024 presidential campaign, Mary Fogel did something that many parents of detained Americans had tried before. She sought the attention of a leader who might have the power to bring her son home. At 95 years old, she wasn't going to let bureaucracy or politics stand in the way of her fight. She wanted answers, and more importantly, she wanted a promise. For years, she had watched as other high-profile Americans were released from Russian custody, often through prisoner swaps or diplomatic negotiations. But despite repeated pleas, Marc's case never seemed to be a priority. Was it because he wasn't a celebrity or a former soldier? Was it because his arrest involved medical cannabis, something still controversial in certain political circles? These questions haunted her, but she refused to stay silent. Then, an opportunity presented itself. She found herself face to face with Donald Trump, the man who could potentially change the course of her son's fate. She didn't waste a second. Looking him in the eye, she asked for a commitment. If he were elected, would he bring her son home? It was a bold request, and one that came at a critical moment. Campaign promises are made all the time, but how often are they actually fulfilled? Leaders shake hands, nod sympathetically, and vow to look into it. But families like Mary's had seen too many broken promises. So what made this time different? Trump didn't hesitate. He gave her his word. He assured her that if he won, he would make Marc's release a priority. But was this just another campaign moment, or would he truly follow through? At that moment, it seemed like a small ray of light in an otherwise dark time. But, as Mary knew, promises from political leaders didn't always come through. Would Trump actually be able to deliver on this promise? Could he secure Marc's release from a country with which the U.S. had such a complicated relationship? Can a single promise from a powerful leader really make that much of a difference in such a high-stakes situation? Marc Fogel was not just another forgotten American prisoner. His mother had fought too hard for his name to be erased from the conversation. Now, with the world's eyes on Trump, the question remained, would he make good on his promise once he had the power to do so? When Donald Trump officially returned to power, many wondered if he would follow through on the promises he made during his campaign. Would Marc Fogel's case truly be a priority, or would it get lost in the whirlwind of presidential responsibilities? Unlike previous administrations that had overlooked Marc's situation, Trump wasted no time. He directed his team to begin working on securing Fogel's release, appointing Special Envoy Steve Witkoff to lead the negotiations. But dealing with Russia was never simple, especially in the tense geopolitical climate where prisoner exchanges often require delicate and strategic maneuvering. How do you negotiate with a government that sees imprisoning Americans as a bargaining chip? While the Fogel family held on to that glimmer of hope, the reality was that the road ahead was far from easy. Marc's detention didn't only involve the political negotiations between the U.S. and Russia. It also involved the personal battles his mother faced in trying to keep her son's name in the headlines. She continued to fight every single day. "It was so hard to keep my faith. But every time I felt like giving up, I remembered that promise. Trump said he would bring Marc home, and I believed in him," Mary confessed. Despite the growing pressure from the media, the government, and activists, nothing seemed to change immediately. The months seemed to stretch on endlessly. But behind closed doors, something was happening. "It's going to take time, but I'm working on it," Trump reassured Mary in their conversations, maintaining his commitment to getting Marc released. Behind the scenes, Trump's legal team and diplomatic efforts began to take shape, though the challenges were immense. Marc's case wasn't the only issue at hand, and negotiations with Russia were delicate. Trump and his team had to navigate a web of international relations, all while making sure that Marc's name wasn't forgotten. "We won't stop fighting. We'll do everything we can," said one of Trump's advisors. But in Russia, Marc's situation was deteriorating. As Mary saw the headlines from abroad, she wondered if her son's story would become just another tragic case of a forgotten prisoner, left to rot in a foreign jail. Do you think the pressure from the media and public outcry helped bring attention to Marc's case? As time passed, Mary continued to rely on the promise that Trump had made to her. Even as the headlines came and went, her belief that her son would come home never wavered. But would Trump keep his word? During an interview, Trump made it clear that Marc's release was a priority for him. "I gave Mary my word that I'd bring her son back home," Trump said. "When a mother asks for help, you don't turn your back on her. We'll get him back." "It felt like a huge weight was lifted off my shoulders when he said that," Mary recalled. "A lot of people had talked to me, but Donald Trump was the one who made the promise. And he meant it." Trump's statement brought a sense of urgency to the situation, and with his high profile, there was now a renewed push to secure Marc's release. For the first time, the Fogel family felt like they had someone who could move mountains for them. But the path to Marc's freedom was still fraught with obstacles. Trump's team worked tirelessly to navigate the complexities of international diplomacy, but the Russian government was not willing to back down easily. Negotiations with Russia were tense, and at times, it seemed as though Marc's release might never happen. Despite these hurdles, Trump kept his focus on his promise to Mary. "A promise is a promise," he often said to those around him, even when faced with setbacks. Finally, after years of uncertainty, legal battles, and diplomatic struggles, the day finally came. On February 11, 2025, Marc Fogel was officially released from Russian custody as part of a negotiated prisoner exchange. It was the moment his family had prayed for, a moment that once seemed impossible. News of his release spread quickly, sparking reactions across the nation. For many, it was a story of justice finally being served. For others, it was proof that no American should ever be forgotten, no matter how complicated their situation might be. But for one person, it was the culmination of a promise made and kept: his 95-year-old mother, Mary Fogel. For Mary Fogel, the moment was nothing short of miraculous. "I can't believe it! My son is finally home," she said, tears streaming down her face as she embraced Marc for the first time in over a year. "Mom, I'm back. I promised you I would come home," Marc said, holding her tight. As they stood there, reunited at last, it was clear that the promise made to a mother had been kept. And it was a promise that changed everything, not just for Marc and Mary, but for their entire family. Shortly after his return, Marc was invited to the White House to meet with the man who had promised to bring him home, President Donald Trump. The meeting was more than just a formal gesture. It was a moment of recognition for a commitment fulfilled. As Marc stood in the Oval Office, shaking hands with Trump, he didn't hold back his gratitude. He publicly praised the president, calling him a hero for keeping his promise and ensuring his freedom. For Trump, it was a moment to reaffirm his stance on protecting American citizens abroad and proving that his words carried weight.